Hello, everyone. I'm Adam Posen from I'm president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and it's my privilege and honor to be the moderator of this closing panel. We're very fortunate today to have Dr. L Mann of the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England to give the closing keynote, and then to have a discussion between her and the Deputy Managing Director, Nigel Clarke. This has been, I got to watch much of today's proceedings on the video stream. I missed the last session in process, but it is in a time when many regimes are continuing to play games with statistics. It has been heartening to watch the seriousness, the honesty, the commitment that the people assembled in this room and the institutions they represent bring to trying to portray the world in the right way. The right way being not the political way, but as accurately as possible, as policy relevant as possible. And so we are very fortunate to have Dr. Clarke and Dr. Mann as the people to try to bring this together. We start with a speech by Catherine. Dr. Mann is an external member of the Monetary Policy Committee. She is in her second term in that role at the Bank of England, which term lasts until end of August 2027. She continues to be a professor of the practice at Brandeis University and a science advisor to the European Investment Bank. Previously, before joining the Bank of England, she was global chief economist at Citibank. And prior to that, she spent 3 years as the chief economist, head of the economics department, and G20 finance deputy at the OECD. In her distant past, for her sins, she was a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute and an economist serving at the Federal Reserve, among other roles. Her work, very appropriately for today, had always been forward-looking on issues of imbalances, digitalization, international economic relationships and outcomes, climate, productivity. And so this is a great opportunity to have Catherine with us. Deputy Managing Director Clarke has been at the fund now for a little over a year. He was previously Jamaica's Minister of Finance and the Public Service and a Member of Parliament for 6 years, more than 6 years. Prior to this, she served as Ambassador of Economic Affairs for Jamaica. His role and leadership in economic issues has long been recognized. In 2022, Mr. Clarke was elected chairman of the Board of Governors at the Inter-American Development Bank. He also is well aware of both the politics and the analytical sides of trying to get policy relevant, accurate, whatever that means, data. As everyone in this room gets, accurate is not the same as what often the person on the street thinks accurate means. But we owe them our best shot. So with that, please let me ask if Catherine Mann will take the podium for her keynote address.
There we go. Thanks very much for the opportunity to join you for this incredible two-day session. I was here today, and I will look forward to seeing on video all the material that was presented yesterday. The quality is extremely high, and I feel like I've come back to my roots. I'm an international economist at heart. I had 2 advisors at MIT. One was Paul Krugman, one Rudy Dornbush. So I bring together both the trade side and the international macro and finance side from way, way back. And of course, in my current position, being a central banker in a small open economy with a very large financial sector, all of the material that has been talked about over the last 2 days are of significant salience to me. I want to talk about 3 different actors here when we consider the challenges when we are evaluating measurement. Now, the language that I'm using here is conforming who does what and why. I'm using the word conforming not to mean that everyone has to conform to the same way of organizing data. But what we do want to try to do is to have a thread, a data thread, and a measurement thread going through these three actors that will allow us to bring them together in a coherent way to evaluate the state of an economy. So let's start with the policymakers. Lots of different policies. I've listed a few here: taxes, tariffs, and subsidies, particularly important for the trade side; regulations and sanctions, pretty important these days for financial side. And we have to recognize that there are other than economic objectives that are part of the policy environment for policymakers. The second set of points there, I think, are particularly important. Borders are fundamental. For a policymaker, the border is fundamental. Why? Because you have voters. They're inside the border. You've got employees. They maybe vote for you. They're inside the border. You have value added. That's a very important ingredient in the state of economic activity within an economy. You have inflation, particularly important. These are measurements that are internal, inside the border. They're certainly affected by what goes on abroad, very much so. But as a policymaker inside, it's these measurements inside a border that are particularly salient. When I say incomplete global common frameworks, that's saying that everybody kind of wants to do it their own way. I've heard quite a bit of commentary on looking for common frameworks that can be applied across all jurisdictions, common ideas, common statistical methods. That is what the BPM is about. It's a true challenge. And we should not underestimate that challenge. And I think Adam already pointed out the extent to which the other than economic objectives can often be more important than the objective of trying to have some common understanding around the economic measurement. My last point there, information is mostly complete. I guess what I mean about that is we usually do know what a tax regime is, what subsidies are, how tariffs are calculated on what. Seems to be a little bit less true these days than perhaps in the past. So information is mostly complete. Now the second group, production, of course, that's firms. Firms do the business. What do they care about? Costs, prices, profits. They invest in things. They also make financing choices. And I think we have to keep that in mind when we try to understand the objectives of firms. What are their objectives? Their job is to optimize across borders, meaning optimize across all of those different policies that are being put into place in order to have the border be meaningful from the standpoint of a policymaker. They're going to optimize across corporate structures. Again, optimize is the word that says, take those rules, tariffs, taxes, et cetera, take those rules as given and optimize across them. And when they're different across borders, as a corporate duty, you're going to optimize across those in terms of trying to improve profitability for your stakeholders, your shareholders. They're going to optimize across financial decisions. And again, I think it's very important to think about what firms do is not just produce stuff and employ people, but they're also making very important financial decisions. And finally, of course, to end that, activities and data do not conform to the borders. There's absolutely no reason why companies care about borders, other than to optimize across the differences that have been put into place by policymakers. The last group, financial intermediation, financial institutions. They also have a variety of things that they do. They take positions, they care about returns, they engage in cross-border financial flows. What do they do that with respect to? They optimize across corporates. So financial institutions are also optimizing not only across corporations, who to invest in and so forth, but implicitly they are optimizing across those decisions that corporates are undertaking, as well as explicitly arbitraging across those regulations as well. And they're going to do that in the context of very complex financial counterparties, often without a lot of transparency. So again, these activities and the data that are associated with these activities do not conform to borders. They really, and they never will. Finally, transactions are opaque. We have to recognize that these private sector actors are not particularly interested in providing the information that you seek. Maybe some of them are willing to, but a lot of them are not. And so in dealing with, we can call it, they'll push back on burden sharing, they'll push back on regulation, but they will also push back because some of the information that you are seeking is business strategic. And so there is a challenge to ask for material or information that is business strategic, because they may not actually believe that you can keep it private. And that's, I think, a significant issue when we start thinking about what we really want to get from companies. Here we go. Let's talk about trade issues. Okay. So over the past couple of days, yesterday in particular, there's quite a bit of discussion of different ways of measuring multinational enterprises' operations across countries. And the material that I've presented here, which is due to one of my colleagues, Rebecca Freeman, who works with Richard Baldwin, who I went to MIT with. It's a very small world, as you all know. This divides up into sort of three different ways of thinking about how to keep track of how the border matters and how cross-border transactions can be measured. And this particular example starts with, okay, where is a Mini Cooper actually made? Well, if you just looked at the car, it was made in Oxford in the United Kingdom. And if it was exported, there you go, it's an export. Second level answer is called face value exposure, which is just taking the imports from home and abroad and taking those out and just looking at the value added internal to Oxford. And then the third is a so-called look-through exposure, which recognizes that the Oxford plant sourcing inputs from home and abroad is only the first round. But of course, there's multiple rounds beyond that. So I know over the last 2 days, there's been quite a bit of discussion about how to measure this. I think the important thing to recognize is looking at the right-hand panel here, is that there's evolving assessment. Policymakers' assessment of what matters and what I want to measure for what reason changes over time. And that creates a particular challenge for a single methodology. So in the 1990s, we cared about global value chains. Where was the value being produced? We were interested in that because of employment. We were interested in that because we wanted to be able to tax it appropriately. And so that would be telling us where the work is actually done. Value-added trade focuses on backward and forward linkages. Trade and value-added, the OECD TIVA database is an example of this. More recently, though, 2020s, global supply chain links are vulnerable. And so you want to measure who is sending what to whom. Is there a vulnerability by either the country in question, being a forward and backward linkage? Is it the frequency of relationship? And so we're going to, rather than looking at value added, focus instead on gross trade. And the example here that the Ambassador Bridge strike, that was the bridge that connects Detroit and Ontario, Canada. One truck full of one part gets stuck on the bridge, and that means the consequences is much greater than the value added measure alone would suggest. So let's look at a couple different measures, what this sort of translates into. If you're looking at the global perspective and looking at the China versus the US as being the #1 intermediate supplier, face value, just what crosses the border. It looks like China increases a whole lot, but the US is still kind of ahead of the game. If you look through the look-through imports, in other words, taking account of the sequential role of China in intermediate production, you get a very different picture. China really has dominated on a look-through basis. And then, on the other hand, if what you want to know about is look-through but value-added, so you can think about where value is produced, who might be employed doing it, get a third different view. Making this concrete for the UK, the left-hand panel shows you the view of, who is the UK's top supplier of imports. In other words, what is their import exposure? What is the UK's import exposure? So looking at the left-hand panel, left set of bars, on a face value basis, the US increased from about 30% to 40% over the 5-year period from 95 to 2020. China went from 0 to 30. Right? So that's a pretty big increase. On the other hand, if you look at the look-through, in other words, taking account of the sequential, China goes from 0 to 50. So that's even kind of more challenging. And I suppose the other point that you can take away from this left-hand set of panels is the consequences of Brexit, which is looking at the German component, which is the aqua, goes from about 45% to 20% on a face value basis, and from 45% to almost, less than 10% on a look-through basis. So that says something about how policies can change the flow of how we want to measure the exposure. Let me turn to a third way of thinking about exposure, which is of increasing importance. And this is looking at not necessarily value added, but looking at potential bottlenecks. So supply chain vulnerability can happen because you have a lot of value added being undertaken in a particular country, or it can be exposure through one small piece being important, or by the number of times a particular country shows up in this multiple flow. And in this diagram, which is a frequency indicator, pass-through frequency indicator available on the OECD's website based on these authors' approach. They're JETRO authors. If you just looked at trade and value added, country B would be the most important party to be worried about or to pay attention to. But if instead you looked at how frequently a country was engaged or was related to the production process, you would find that country C was more important to the production process. And we can evaluate this in a number of different ways, but I think I'm going to probably move on to financial flows. So we can look at these financial flows in a similar sort of way in terms of value added, gross, and concentration. So here's an example of some of the product that comes out of the IMF. And I wanted to focus in particular on this chart about financial flows through opaque entities, non-bank financial institutions in particular, are increasingly important. Why is this relevant? The middle chart shows the extent to which NBFIs have become more important and their links to banks. NBFIs are not regulated, banks are, and so there's a conduit through which exposures in the non-bank financial intermediation sector can percolate into the regulated sector in a bank. In particular, one particular type of NBFI is particularly interesting, and that is the hedge fund. And I will move to my next chart to tell you why we care about hedge funds. So this is a zeroing in on the UK, again, just as I did in the case of the trade flows. We're going to zero in on the UK gilt market. Why does the central bank care about these kinds of cross-border flows, and who are the enterprises involved? So this is an indication of repo borrowing and who's doing repo borrowing. Repos on gilts. And you can see the extent to which there's been a change from the purple group, which is the insurers and the pensioners, pension funds, to the hedge funds. Now, why does this matter? It matters not partly because of regulation, but it also matters because the objectives and the time horizon of the hedge fund is different from that of the insurance, pension funds, and long-term investors. So the NBFI to bank link matters because banks ultimately can access liquidity facilities at the Bank of England. So the sterling market facilities. So we care about the NBFI bank links because ultimately our mechanism for providing liquidity is through the sterling market facilities. We care about who is engaged in these activities, the NBFI sovereign debt links, because the hedge funds have a different time horizon. They trade rapidly, and they trade based on very small spreads, and they trade with very high leverage. That's their business model. And so if there is any challenge or if there is any issue with hedge funds, it will percolate down to banks and to the liquidity facilities. I can also refer you to some Bank of Canada work that shows the extent to which hedge fund activities in the Canadian sovereign debt market shows that the role of these enterprises, financial institutions, in the auction markets is good in the sense that they buy a lot of central bank debt or sovereign debts, and that's good, reduces the price of sovereign debt. That's a good thing. But they are also more volatile. And so there's a trade-off between lower cost of sovereign debt for the fiscal authority and higher volatility in sovereign debt valuation when you have these kinds of players involved. As I said, there's also additional risks that come from opacity with regard to counterparty exposures. I'm going to give you a chart which I will explain what is going on here. Okay. I will leave the explanation for the notes, and we'll conclude here. It has to do with hidden leverage and the degree of concentration. So concluding, borders matter for policy, but borders are not the lens for private actors. And it's not going to be the lens for private actors. So accounting and business conventions differ. and they create incentives for opaqueness. The evolving policymaker needs for data, it's not just the policymaker that has evolving needs for data, it's also researchers. So if we want to think of policymakers as being guided by research, then the research has to be able to access the data to do that. I list here transaction level data, it's been mentioned several times, and the advantage of transaction level data is that because it can be sliced, diced, and aggregated to fit whatever your objective is, it is the most flexible. Timeliness, there was this discussion about this earlier, so I'm not going to add to that. Missing data. A lot of people have argued and noted about missing data for actors, missing data on exposures, but I would like to emphasize the need for prices of these transactions, if it's goods and services, and asset returns, if we're talking about financial flows. We are not going to be able to do research using the data alone that comes from cross-border transactions and flows. We have to have the research on the P as well as the Q in order to evaluate why these behaviors are showing up. And the complementary data that I suggest is domestic to foreign crosswalks, because ultimately it's the domestic thing that is going to drive policymakers' concerns. That's the inside the border. I need to be able to match up foreign data, foreign classifications, to my domestic classifications. Currency valuations, there was also already a good presentation that noted the importance of that. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mann. It's now time we have ready some themes to try to get answers and thoughts out of both our distinguished speakers. I just want to, on behalf of everybody, thank Catherine for her big picture think from the first to the last slide and making very clear the divergence for incentives to take borders seriously and to be opaque or not about them depending on where you sit. I think that was a very important insight. So just starting with Catherine, instead of at the general level, which you gave your talk, in your role as a central banker, and as you mentioned, central banker for a small open economy with a large financial system, where do you see cross-border data gaps causing you and your colleagues blind spots at the moment? What are some of the things, be it multinational profit shifting, digital trade, intangibles, or is it the financial issues? Where do you see the blind spots?
I think there are two that are particularly important. One is on the structural side. As a central banker, you care about the near-term issues because they are very salient for the 3-year monetary policy horizon, but you also care about structural trends because those are very important for driving the supply side of the economy. So if I had to kind of divide up the two areas into trends and structural trends and near-term concerns, structural trends, it's understanding the fundamental changes in the economy that has resulted from the departure from the European Union. Mm-hmm. I set that out as a particularly notable in the diagram. Those structural trends, it's terms in the number of players, it's so therefore market structure and degree of competition, degree of variety, and pricing. And so those are structural issues that are extremely important. For the shorter term, the monetary policy horizon, the thing that I particularly care about is cross-border spillovers from financial market decisions and policy decisions in my neighborhood, and the extent to which it affects my financial conditions, and therefore the decisions that I have to make 8 times a year.
Terrific, thank you. Deputy Managing Director Clarke, given the ongoing changes in the world economy emanating from multinational enterprises and the various trading arrangements, and as Catherine said, global value chains as opposed to supply chains and all these complexities. How do you think the IMF, or should the IMF, rethink its approach to measuring and interpreting global imbalances? I mean, we're a very different world than when Keynes and Harry Dexter White first worried about that for the fund.
Yeah, thank you for that. There's been a lot of thinking about that. The IMF produced its external sector report in 2025, which highlighted the important challenges that exist in measuring the current account.
Right.
If you can't measure the current account, you have no accurate measure of global imbalances. Measurement and consistency challenges have become more exacerbated with the deepening of the interconnectedness between and among countries and an increase in trade and financial flows. Traditionally, merchandise goods, you would rely on customs data. But even so, what we know is that globally, when you add up all exports and you take away all imports, you're left with a discrepancy, which in 2024 was about $200 billion. So clearly, the change in patterns of trade introduce challenges that we have to confront with. Catherine mentioned some of the thinking that, for one, we probably need to factor in measures of value add as opposed to focusing exclusively on gross flows. We will, trying to capture value add means trying to put our fingers on where economic value is being created in the global value chain. But we're also going to need to think about data in a different way. We're going to need to have more data on economic activity cross-border. And I think the expression is data on from whom to whom, so to speak. We are going to have to consider how transactions are settled in the emerging world, in the world that is going to that is emerging. New currencies, new digital currencies and forms of payment that are going to have to be captured somehow, and having cross-border means of capturing some of this data will be increasingly important.
It's an incredible scope of work, and I'm glad that the fund is trying to take it on, and obviously in partnership with others in this room. Catherine, Nigel has taken us more into, with his last remarks, into some of the financial flows aspects, and you were mentioning the various prices or positions that you also wanted to know about. Given the UK's exposure to cross-border financial flows, what are the key challenges that these new types of flows, transactions, he mentioned some of the fintech that has come in recent years, or clearing changes, create for decision makers today? I mean, and how much should this feed back into the balancing between restrictive regulation and innovation in some of these spaces? How much should the need for better data be brought into that discussion?
I think the important, there are plenty of dark corners now that we don't know enough about. And, if we look forward, there are definitely an increasing set of actors and activities that challenge the existing statistical systems. But there are some really significant issues now. And an important point is that we, in some sense, we don't have traction to get the information that we need. If you are a regulator, you have traction. You can ask for the information because you're a regulator. if it's an unregulated entity, you don't have much traction. And to the extent that enterprises have a business model that involves cross-border regulatory arbitrage, and I'm not saying it's illegal, that's legal, right? We can leave the illegal stuff out. That was a discussion earlier today too, in terms of where the boundary was. Cross-border arbitrage across regulatory regimes is very much part of the activity. So this sort of suggests that how do countries with their borders and the objectives that they have within their border, how does that create an environment which enhances cross-border arbitrage or tries to eliminate it, right? This is a matter for, I remember going back to my G20 days, this was base erosion profit shifting.
Right.
The point when countries realized that none of them were getting much in the way of tax revenues,
Right.
because it was all being arbitraged away by enterprises. That realization was really the only way in which the base erosion profit shifting strategy started to develop.
Right.
So countries have to realize that sometimes you have to find the commonality in a strategy in order to get where you want to go.
Very nicely said. Nigel, can I come back to you on this issue of cross-border financial innovation? How does the fund approach measurement and data collection of crypto asset stablecoins? I mean, obviously, in addition to the longer-term data issues we're talking about today, you have surveillance issues, you have contemporary decisions to make. So how do you look at that?
Well, let's probably start by dimensioning what is reported to be the scope of these activities. The market capitalization of cryptocurrency, notwithstanding market activities over the last week or so, has fluctuated between about $3 trillion and $4.2 trillion over the last 6 months.
Wow.
The market capitalization of stablecoins is reported to be in the region of 289 billion and growing. And a survey by the BIS in 2024 concluded that about 85 of the 93 central banks surveyed were thinking about CBDCs. I mention all of this as a preface to say that this is a challenge that is coming fast over the horizon. The good news is that the standards that IMF has worked towards, the 2025 SNA and the BPM 7, are very clear on the classification, and a very clear distinction is drawn and made that backed crypto can be classified as financial assets, non-backed crypto are classified as non-produced, non-financial asset. As easy as cheese in terms of the classification. The challenge, however, is that capturing the data, the volume, is extremely difficult given the decentralized nature of these forms of payments or financial assets, non-financial assets, as the case may be, given the price volatility that is often a feature of these, and also given the combination of illicit flows that are sometimes commingled and so forth. So this is absolutely challenging, and it's likely that given the dichotomy between the private and the public that Catherine mentioned, and the proclivity to trade across borders as is inherent to private sector activity, it is likely that you're going to need to have cross-country exchanges of data, etc., if we are to be able to fully capture what is happening in this space. The cliche that says where regulatory gaps exist, you're going to have measurement gaps.
Yep.
So we're going to have to sort of incorporate that truth in the way in which we approach this challenge.
So Nigel, if I can bring you back to some of the earlier themes of this conference, but coming off of what you said about need for new cross-border ways to collect data or to try. We've heard the chief statistician's views on the previous panel talk about the investment required to implement the new BPM and SNA recommendations. Does the IMF have a role for advancing this, for working with national statistical agencies, for trying to improve the transparency in the collection, and maybe even helping create the demand for resources, or the supply of resources, I guess, better than the demand?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is absolutely.
Right.
And the IMF has, and I can speak to it as a former finance minister, has a track record of working with national statistical bodies among its membership in helping to improve capacity. And a track record also that's going to be absolutely necessary, working with lower capacity countries, low income and fragile states where institutions are probably not as strong, and helping to strengthen and boost their capacity. The IMF is working in a collaborative way and supporting various initiatives that exist. I mean, first of all, we have our IMF Big Data sort of center activity where we collaborate with hosts of big data. We are tangentially involved in the G20 Data Gap Initiative. And one of the important roles that we will certainly have is to ensure what we can to strengthen or to help strengthen in statistical agencies in countries to remain independent and autonomous, to produce credible, reliable data. So absolutely, the fund has a key role in capacity development as a key part of the IMF's toolkit, and particularly capacity development as it relates to the 2025 SNA and the BPM7 will be a huge part of our work going forward.
That's great. So we're getting near the end of time. Let me give Dr. Mann one more question, and then we'll try to get in quickly a couple questions from the audience. So Catherine, I've been encouraged, and I'm glad to pose to you a question that's been posed to people a couple times previously during the conference, which is, what's your wish list? You have the cream of the world's economic statisticians arrayed before you. I mean, what is it that would be your top priorities for future research on cross-border economic and financial linkages?
So there are two things. One I've already mentioned, which is prices. I didn't hear a whole lot about prices. I'm a central banker right now. Prices matter a lot. So so a complement to the data that is being discussed here in terms of flows is the matching prices. The second, I think, is more challenging, and that is I heard a lot of discussion about ownership. Multinationals are owned in one country, or its headquarters is in one country. It has all these other activities in other countries. Ownership of a multinational, we have to be very careful about thinking about that, because if it is a listed firm, let's say on the London Stock Exchange, who owns all those shares? It's not Londoners, not the UK. Those shares are owned abroad by a whole host of owners. So who is, when we think about the financial side of ownership as opposed to a geographic side of ownership, you may end up with a very different picture of who owns what.
Very Good. The who is us question is back. If there is desire, would someone like to pose a question to the DMD or Dr. Mann? We have the microphones are still live. Going once. People are tired, but still going twice. We're asymptoting to the end. Okay, we will close it out there. I believe the conference leadership gets the true last word, but please join me in thanking Dr. Catherine Mann and Dr. Nigel Clarke.
Thank you for this great panel and these important insights. Indeed, we're going to close this conference, and it's a pity because there's so much to talk about, and I would love to have 2 more days to discuss this, even if it would go in the weekend. But I see a number of suitcases already. You have your flights going back, and we need some time to digest what has been said and look into the great advice that we got. So let me just start by thanking people, because this has not been possible without people. First, our keynote speakers, Catherine Mann, Nigel Clarke, Simon Johnson, and Posen for the moderating. Moderating of our various session, Cheng Hoon, Nigel Clarke, Mariana, Jan, Jim, Gian Maria, and Adam. All panelists and presenters who traveled here or joined remotely. There were many people following the sessions online. All of you who enriched our discussions with your comments, with your advice. We had more than 3,000 views of the sessions across all platforms, YouTube, LinkedIn, and IMF Live. So that is great. But I also want to specifically thank the great team, the STA Forum team, led by Deputy Jim, Dragana, and Bogdan, along with colleagues from CSF, ITD, COM, these are departments in the IMF. So this alphabetically: Dane, Emmanuel, Isha, Eurydice, Evelyn, Hiba, Jacques, Yannick, Laila, Mahmoud, Maya, Mer, Patrick, Xi, Red, Rukayat. I really want to ask you all to join me, give them their applause. This has been a team effort, and I think the team is amazing. So what are the key takeaways? Well, first of all, we have a job to do. As you said, Adam, it's a great agenda that Nigel described, and we're up to it. We want to do that. I mean, these cross-border economic and financial linkages, all these changes, these are very important for policymakers. So we need to ensure there's the data there so they can do the job. And the researchers can do the job, so translate this data into knowledge to be used by the policymakers. And so who else then we can do that as economic statisticians? We need to step up and try to understand what's going on in the world as good as possible, using all that we do. And when I started working in statistics 30 years ago, life was quite easy. We just sent out a questionnaire and we got the answers back. We added it up, we imputed no response, and that was it. It's much more complicated and more interesting now. I mean, there's all this data out there, and our job is to ensure that we use all the data out there, private data, shared data, administrative data, big data, small data, whatever, to ensure there's a nice picture, a picture that can be used. And this is complex, but also it's very interesting. So one of the conclusions, but that's not new, we already knew that, but it's really enforced. We have a job to do, we have a task, we have to stand up and ensure there's good economic data. So the last 2 days, we got more insights in exactly what are the things needed, what are the data points needed. Actually, in this panel, some new things were added. We didn't speak a lot about prices, I agree, but these are important. So new things are added. But we also show a lot of great approaches, innovative approaches, using alternative data sources, using AI, using shared data. So I think together we are a creative and innovative community, and we can build on what has been presented today. So what has been achieved already? Well, we launched the Balance of Payments 7 and SNA 2012 manuals. And these are great foundational guidelines how to deal with these issues. And it was hard time, 70 years ago, were the old manuals, so they didn't really reflect the present economy anymore. So that's a great step forward. We're also supporting countries to update these standards with technical assistance by developing compilers guidance for knowledge exchange, the compilers hub that's being demonstrated there. Our first externally launched AI tool as IMF, the talk to the manuals, and a virtual assistant that does not hallucinate when addressing data queries, StatGPT, that's not officially launched yet, but in beta version, and a number of you already have tested it. We also build tools to measure global value chains. Yesterday there was a very enthusiastic presentation by the statistics team about Mario, the multi-regional input-output table. This builds on great cooperation with Eurostat and OECD for their work on that. And that's basically another issue. We can and we do not want this alone. This is really cooperation and working together. But by having these multi-input-output tables, we can study much more. Where is the trade and value added? What are the linkages? And we saw some examples that this is also translated in where products are used, so having some more input in risks. Factorless goods production came up a lot the last couple of days, and we have knowledge how to deal with that, some concrete experiences, and I think we can build on that. And loss cage units came up a lot. Many countries have them inside and outside Europe, and it's really useful to have a group that really studies these M&Es, knows them inside out, have contact with them, knows what their roles in the global value chains, and try to make data consistent. On digital finance side, we are advancing an understanding of the relationship with monetary aggregates. We started to gather reliable information on cryptos and stablecoins, and we are tackling bilateral asymmetries. As Christy said, we're working on this for a very long time, but we're making concrete advancements. And, well, for example, the presentation by the ECB, looking at data from the US, it really shows where the asymmetries are, and I think we can do things. And James' dream about having this big global business register, staging data, well, maybe we can move steps in that direction. So what is our homework? Because these statistical conferences are not just nice and without obligation. We really want to do something with what we heard. 3 years ago, our Statistical Forum was about intangibles. Pricing played an important role there. 2 years ago, it was about digital money. Last year, it was about AI. And all these recommendations, all the insights, they found their way. They found their way in the statistical manuals themselves. You can find guidance that was discussed in these meetings, but also on the research agenda. So our research project that we're doing together with the international organization, with countries, well, things we discussed the last statistical forums found their way, so really building on that. So what's our homework now? I'm making 4 points, but that's not exhaustive. As I said, we need to digest a bit more what has been said. But first of all, M&E activities, more granular data on that, trying to understand better what's going on. We need to have the M&E firm level data, trying to have alternative data sources to know more about them, try to exchange data without confidentiality issues. So that's really a thing we can look into more, looking at the large case units. More refined measures of crypto assets flows, stablecoins, and CBDC movement. What do you say, knife and ESGs? Yeah, we know the definitions, but they were not there yet. I mean, now we have to really measure that and get the data. But we saw today that there's a lot out there, and there's not one source that will fill the gap. There's the surveys, there's the administrative data. I know Brazil has some very interesting work done on cross-border acquisitions of cryptos, but also commercial private data will fill part of the puzzle. So basically, we statisticians are making jigsaw puzzles, getting all the informations together and trying to make a picture. Closing gaps on portfolio investment held under custodian arrangements, expanding FDR reporting requirements to conduct connected countries, really trying to get the data from all countries. And we need to think how we can look into the asymmetries. We can provide some tools as STA and other international organizations, but in the end, we need to bring compilers together. And well, this is really important because if we keep on having global imbalances with Mars or Venus, that really makes the trustworthiness of statistics not so good, but more important, analytical usefulness is in hand. So we will all do these things. We will work on that. We'll try to feed it in the research agenda, in new statistical guidance, and I really thank you all for your contributions. So with this, we end the Statistical Forum. I hope you found it as entertaining and interesting as I did. But again, we're not always only looking backwards, we also look forwards. Next year we'll have another statistical forum, and the tradition we have is that we will always get your votes already today. What should be the topic for next year? So there will be a QR code on the screen, there it is. So if you look at that, you get a Menti, and you can vote on topics that we should do next year. And there's, I guess, also an open box that you can put in your own ideas, right? So it's not only a closed session. So please tell us what we should talk about and have the forum about next year. But yeah, I want to thank you for your attendance. I want to thank you for all your contributions, and I hope to see you next year.